Welcome back to the Healthy Orange Movie Reviews. I'm your host, Bennett Campbell Ferguson, and this is the 5th installment in my series on my favorite films of the 2000s. Now before we begin, I need to explain something. I made an executive decision right at the beginning not to rank these movies on my list from 1 to 10, because I've tried ranking in the past, and I've found it's ridiculous. You get into these insane arguments with yourself about what makes one film better than the other. And as a result, you really end up seeing the worst in movies that you absolutely love. Because you inevitably work from the top, it becomes a process of saying, oh, well, this film, as much as I love it, had one joke I disliked. It goes down a slot below, which is just insane to me, because movies are different, and sometimes the things that make them different make them equally great and equally valuable. But there is one thing I must own up to. If I were to rank this list, Sofia Coppola's Lost in Translation would be at the top, and today I am going to tell you why. So the story of Lost in Translation is really quite simple. But to understand the nature of the movie and what it is that makes it so beautiful, you have to understand not just the narrative and the facts of what happens, but the aura of it. So to begin, Lost in Translation takes place in Tokyo. It starts with Bob Harris, a washed-up movie star played by Bill Murray, arriving in Tokyo to shoot a commercial there. And we see him asleep and waking up in his taxi cab and seeing the city for the first time. And I think it's interesting that Sofia Coppola, as a writer, as a director, she chose not to begin the movie with him leaving his home in Los Angeles. She chose to start in Tokyo with him arriving, which to me makes me feel more immersed in the film, because you're just immersed in this one location. That's all you know within the context of this story and these characters' lives. And I will come back to that later and elaborate on the significance of that. But the main point is, you learn pretty quickly that Bob is essentially miserable. He's constantly getting phone calls from his wife back home in which she passive-aggressively berates him for forgetting his kids' birthdays and for failing to tell her which color carpet he wants in his study, and all these petty disagreements. And so we see that he's sapped of energy. He's hapless. He was once a huge and popular star, but now he's content to do this Japanese whiskey commercial and make some easy money. But the story is not confined to Bob alone, not by any stretch of the imagination. Soon after we meet him, we see a woman sitting in the same hotel, but in a different room on a windowsill. And her name is Charlotte, and she's played by Scarlett Johansson. And the movie acquires a very different feel when it's focused on her. Now, one of the great things about Bill Murray as an actor and his performance as Bob in this film is that he is a comedian. He's playing a realistic character, but his performance in this film revolves a lot around dialogue and deadpan one-liners and that kind of humor and storytelling. Whereas Scarlett Johansson is not renowned for that kind of verbal dexterity. She's a great performer of a very different stripe. And so Sofia Coppola, working with that, gives her the parts of the film that she's in a totally different feel. So, for instance, this first image of her sitting on the windowsill, alone at night, high up on the hotel while her husband is snoring in bed. It's a quiet, wordless image of kind of restless unease and loneliness, and that permeates the film, the entirety of the story. We see a lot of scenes with her rambling around Tokyo, sightseeing essentially, but it's more than that. She's not just looking at gardens and temples and whatnot. Her place in this foreign city and her isolation, her detachment from anyone, gives us a sense of her loneliness, which is partly a product of her marriage, which is, needless to say, not that great. Her husband, played by Giovanni Ribisi, is an absolute boyish jerk. But we get the sense in the scenes with Charlotte of a deeper isolation, a deeper unease and frustration and loneliness that comes from someone who hasn't found their calling, hasn't discovered what they love or who they love in life. But Lost in Translation would be a very unsatisfying movie indeed if that did not change. And so it soon does when Bob and Charlotte meet. Now, the first time they meet is just this fantastic moment. They're in the elevator, in a crowded elevator, and he looks across the elevator and sees her. And, you know, she's the only American there in this hotel elevator, so his eyes go right to her. And they exchange a brief glance, and she kind of looks away, and they go their separate ways. But gradually their paths begin to cross in the hotel bar until they spend one night they can't sleep, and so they both end up sitting at the bar and talking and telling each other about each other's lives. Bob talks about his failures as a father and as a husband and his midlife crisis, and Charlotte talks about how she's not sure what to do with her life, essentially. Now, when I first saw this scene, when I saw the movie, I believe it was back in 2004, I wasn't particularly... I would not say I was unimpressed by it, but it didn't move me in any special way. But here's the thing. Lost in Translation is a movie that creeps up on you. It's a mood piece, essentially. And so not a lot happens. So it takes some time for you to realize that it's not that the story is uneventful. It's that everything is happening. It's happening within these small moments, within the minds of the characters and the moments they're sharing together. And that's what begins to happen. Soon Charlotte invites Bob to come out with her and some friends, and they spend this night on the town that is just intoxicating to watch. It starts out in a restaurant, and then someone starts chasing them with a BB gun. They run through an arcade and out into the streets and catch a car, and then they all end up back at this guy's apartment singing karaoke in this magnificent modernist apartment that's high above the city in this, clean, glassy skyscraper, and there are laser lights in the room, and to me, this moment captures the exhilaration of spending time with other people and being silly and going, in a sense, berserk. Bob, when he's doing karaoke, belts out some Elvis Costello, and Charlotte puts on a pink wig, and you get this freewheeling, joyous experience that where you're caught up with the characters in this night of joy, and and they're essentially liberated from the kind of soul-numbing isolation and frustration that's plagued them until that point. And it continues on from there, although in a very, very different vein. These friends that Charlotte and Bob go out with, as it turns out, are perhaps not the greatest people in the world. There's a minor revelation later on that causes Bob and Charlotte to turn away from them, at least for the moment. So Bob and Charlotte's relationship, they grow closer together on their own together. And so we see them going out to restaurants, we see them hanging out alone at night watching TV, and this is the crux of the film. This is where the problem arises. Not the problem with the movie artistically, because it is perfect by my count, but the problem for Bob and Charlotte. In this strange world of Tokyo, a world that is alien to them, very different from what they know, in the beginning they're not entirely satisfied with it. Bob makes a joke about wanting to, first get out of the hotel, get out of the bar, and then get out of the city and the country and get back. But he and Charlotte begin to love it and begin to feel at home in it and begin to prefer it, I believe, to the rest of their existence. And so much of the movie builds up to the moment where Bob says, "I don't want to leave." Because even though they're these two strangers whose paths have just crossed in this particular moment, at this particular place, possibly very briefly, there's a connection, there's a longing to be together, and there's a beauty to their experiences in this world. And so essentially, there's a little bit of a ticking clock in Lost in Translation, because the clock is ticking toward the moment when Bob inevitably has to leave and return to his family back home. And Charlotte eventually will have to leave as well, because like him, she also lives in Los Angeles with her husband. And so this incredible melancholy begins to arise. And the first time I saw the movie, I was on the edge of my seat. I was desperate for them to find some way to be together, even though Bob was too old and Charlotte was too young, and the whole thing was impossible, and they might not even like each other were it not for this extreme situation of being together in a foreign country. But I wanted them to be together. But knowing what happens now, knowing what the end of the film is, I watch it in a very, very different way. I watch it just savoring every moment, whether it's Charlotte sitting alone on a train looking out the window, or Bob running through the streets while there's some kind of political campaign shenanigans going on. Every moment I savor. And because Sofia Coppola allowed the plot to ramble, essentially, allowed it to not be too over-determined by this has to happen and this has to happen, the movie's allowed to breathe, and you get to live in each moment and live in Tokyo with Bob and Charlotte in these hotel rooms and elevators. And on that note, there's an interesting sound effect that persists throughout the movie, and the sound effects are by Richard Biggs, who has done almost all of Sofia Coppola's movies. I think all of them, in fact. And it's the sound that plays in the elevator where Bob and Charlotte the sound that plays in the elevator at the hotel where Bob and Charlotte are staying, and it's kind of the beeping of the elevator as it goes from floor to floor. I think it goes something like boom, 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 and it plays at the beginning when they first see each other, and it plays at the end when they're saying goodbye, and when Charlotte is getting into the elevator and the doors are closing in front of her face and Bob's looking after her. And that, in that sound, there's every emotion, you know, about how much they care about each other, how wondrous this experience they've had together is. It's all there in the images and in that sound that seems to bind the movie together. And it's I don't know quite where to go from there. It's never easy to explain exactly why you love a movie, and the pressure is double when it's a film that you love practically above all others. And I mean, Lost in Translation is a movie that means absolutely everything to me. I mean, it's a movie. There's something about it. There's something just visually and emotionally enrapturing and wonderful and lovable. But maybe the best way to describe that, as I often do, is to tell you about a perfect scene. Now, at that karaoke party that I mentioned before, where Bob and Charlotte and everyone's singing and going crazy, Bob takes a couple pictures. And later in the film, we see him alone in the back of a car, taking out one of the pictures of Charlotte and looking at it. And in that moment, you feel everything. You feel how much he cares for her. You feel the depth of their friendship, of everything, of everything that it means. And that's why it's worth going on this journey, going through this film, going through Tokyo and Bob's and Charlotte's life, this episode in their lives. It's worth it to feel that emotion, to feel the strength of the emotion. And because Lost in Translation is a small, poetic, everyday story, something that's real, the emotion is so much greater and more beautiful than it could be in anything else. And I think that is why, that even though the movie has what is now a rather famously ambiguous ending, you leave, or at least I always come out of it feeling overpowered, overwhelmed, but also overjoyed. And in the final scene, when Bob and Charlotte's emotions for each other finally come pouring out, and then soon after, as we see the camera going high amidst the sunny skyscrapers of Tokyo, you feel excitement and happiness and everything that you might have wanted to feel in the film but didn't know that you could. And it's because of that it's let me put it this way. There are some films that you can watch and walk away from, and some that are where you can't quite go back to your normal life because the movie is a life unto itself, a world unto itself. And Lost in Translation is a movie like that. It's a movie that somehow carries you away and makes you feel as if you're floating towards something that seems unattainable, and this higher state of being that is somehow perfectly, absolutely, beautifully, and sweetly real. So that's all I have to say about Sofia Coppola's magnificent, magnificent movie. If you will join me in 1 week, right here, you can hear me talk about Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy. And so, I think that will be all. Sayonara.